Sorry about that, about the cutoff there. So what they were saying is that not long after Grant had reported his observations to his aunt on the north side of English Bay, a fledgling organization formed on the south side, just 5 miles away. They gave themselves the deceptively Canadian name, the Don't Make a Wave Committee, but this would prove to be a misnomer. And in 1970, they would change it to Greenpeace. More on that later. But by the time Hadwin got into it, the West Coast logging industry was highly mechanized, but still almost completely unaware of environmental issues. There was only sporadic replanting of logged areas, and conservation as we know it today was a negligible concern. On both sides of the border, the forests of the Northwest were still being treated like a kind of inexhaustible golden goose. In relationship to local governments, the timber industry was generally one of self-serving collusion with the emphasis on being volume and speed. The working motto was, quote, get the cut out, end quote. It was nothing to clear-cut both sides of an entire valley and simply move up to the next, and in fact, it was standard procedure, decade after decade, valley after valley. After all, there were so many, especially in British Columbia. The story goes on to talk about how a lot of these areas were inaccessible by road. It seemed like the forest went on forever. Personally, having family in Alaska and having spent my childhood up there at different points, you run into this in places, even to the point that I know better, and I spend time in times in Alaska. I have felt like there's this like an infinite amount of land, because in Alaska, in British Columbia, you are so small. People are so small. Towns are so small compared to the landscapes around them, compared to the distances between the next town or the next city, that it feels like you're dwarfed by land, and that anything that can happen to land is just like a blip on the radar. Of course, us being in the lower 48, we know that's not the case. Hadwin, in true form, didn't stay with his uncle long. He had a brief apprenticeship. He headed deep into the coast mountains to the former mining town of Gold Bridge, 4 hours north of Vancouver. Hadwin hardly knew the area well. His family had owned a cabin at Big Gun Lake just outside of town since he was a child. Insulated from the outside world by a natural fortress of high rugged mountains, Gold Bridge had always been a marginal place. The rivers there run glacier green, and the only access was via rough roads lined with fatal drop-offs. A few miles to the south lies the ruins of the Burlone Pioneer Mine, the most lucrative gold mine in British Columbia. In its heyday, it employed thousands of men who worked as much as a mile underground, breathing dank recycled air in excess of 120 degrees. When the mine closed in 1971, it had caused the local population to plummet to just a few hundred people. Today, grizzly bears, wolves, and goats outnumber the people. Gold Bridge is a coastal town in British Columbia. Here you're going to see guys playing with a drone. You can kind of get a sense of the landscape here of what Gold Bridge was like or is like today. Beautiful area. I mean, landscape's beautiful. Population small. Tough to get to. The roads that go up in this part of British Columbia, as much of British Columbia is, are small. 2-lane paved roads if you're lucky, but a lot of times they're just dirt roads. Before finding his calling as a commercial timber scout and layout engineer, Hadwin worked variously as a logger, prospector, heavy equipment operator, blaster, and hard rock driller. Between jobs, he spent a lot of time on his own, hunting and exploring the surrounding wilderness. In the evenings, he seemed to oscillate between the two poles representing his father and his uncle, the surprisingly suburban pastime of contract bridge, and the rowdy nights in the local bars. One of Hadwin's neighbors recalled him and a man named Franklin, stretching their penises across a bar in order to determine whose was longer, while a native woman named Big Edith refereed. No doubt similar contests went on unrecorded in Dodge City a century earlier. On another occasion, a man in a Burlone bar bet Hadwin $100 that he couldn't climb 1,000 vertical feet in an hour. This is no mean feat in the Coast Range, which is composed of steep, slab-faced mountains with 40 to 50 degree slopes covered in loose rock and snow are commonplace. But Hadwin left the bar and returned shortly with the money. When asked where his money was, the man, realizing with whom he was dealing, reneged. But Hadwin went out and timed himself anyway, just to prove he could do it. Hadwin was a person who threw himself fully into every undertaking. His stamina and competitiveness were the stuff of local legend, and he was well known for running his co-workers into the ground. Even with his hands in his pockets, he could scamper over stuff like you wouldn't believe a former resident who now works for the Ministry of Forest recalled. He needed a jetpack just to keep up with him. He was in the best condition of any man I've ever seen, explained Paul Bernier, a longtime colleague and close friend. We'd run into the bush, we'd race each other, he didn't like to lose. The legendary American frontiersman Daniel Boone reportedly was able to cover 40 miles a day while traveling through rough country. Hadwin would have no trouble keeping pace with him. The experience of traveling overland was with a fit West Coast logger would leave most people breathless and struggling. Laden with the heavy chainsaw, tool belt, and cans of gas and oil, they can move through a steep mountain forest, cougar country as sometimes called, with remarkable grace and speed. Let's skip it, because I've been reading a lot here. There's a lot to kind of cover here, but a lot of it is really talking about Hadwin's daringness. One of the things that this same guy, Paul Bernier, was with him, and they came across a pair of grizzly bears near a place called Lone Goat Creek. Instead of watching them quietly or heading in the opposite direction, Hadwin started clapping his hands and yelling to get their attention. He succeeded in the bear's charge. Grizzlies are surprisingly fast, and once provoked, they will descend on a target with terrifying inevitability of furred and clawed locomotive. Lewis and Clark described the encounters with these bears, in which they were forced to shoot them simply to keep them from getting attacked. One animal absorbed 10 musket balls before finally collapsing. Neither Hadwin nor Bernier were armed, and when they had only a matter of seconds to decide what to do before the bears arrived, or possibly tear them apart, Hadwin assessed the wind direction, and, with Bernier hot on his heels, the bears gaining rapidly, he dodged across the stream and went downwind where the short-sighted animals couldn't find them. On another occasion, late in fall, Hadwin set off to the mountains on a spontaneous hunting trip. Despite an early snow, he was equipped with nothing but a jean jacket, a half-empty 40-pounder of vodka, and an open-sighted Manticore rifle. I don't know if I said that right, but a rifle. 2 days later, he returned with a mountain goat over his shoulders. Mountain goats are far from difficult to get close to. They're very difficult to get close to, and it's impressive under those circumstances that he was able to not only kill one, but bring it back on his shoulders. As mountain goats and Dall sheep in this area up through Alaska, they're like the prize of hunting because they can see you coming from a long ways away and they're very sure-footed, so that's pretty impressive that he was able to do that. There were other points in which they discussed Hadwin getting so drunk and falling asleep in the back of his Studebaker pickup truck. I'll show you what it looks like in a moment. Sleeping in it all night, waking up covered in snow. It's like a surprise that he didn't freeze to death. Someone who Hadwin during his Goldbridge days likened his lean, sharp-eyed appearance in a remote manner to James Dean's and Clint Eastwood's. There were women who admired him, usually from afar. Quiet and courteous, though Hadwin generally was, he possessed an almost tangible intensity, a piercing, in-your-face conviction that some found alarming. He always had to be the best. He had to be the first, as Aunt Barbara recalled. It always had to be Grant's way. There was never any room for compromise. And yet compromise, an ugly, elemental kind, lies at the root of the timber business, particularly if you're a person like Hadwin, who thrives on nature in her rawest forms. The forest he and his colleagues saw in British Columbia in the 1960s and 70s were the same ones Alexander Mackenzie encountered nearly 200 years earlier. They were dark, dense, and apparently endless, and filled with frightening animals. Because most of BC's coast was inaccessible by road, it remains among the wildest regions in North America. With the exception of the occasional hunter or prospector, surveyors and timber cruisers are often the first Europeans ever to set foot in these daunting forests. Most of those who come later were only passing through because, despite the abundance of raw materials, there are very few ways to make a living in a place like Goldbridge. Successful mines are a rarity, and most loggers were brought in from the outside. But Hadwin found a way to do it. As Paul Bernier put it, he was a de facto division engineer and in charge of a cut block layout and design. Basically, his job was to go in there to find ways to make roads where there weren't roads. Also, in the book, it mentions around this time, 1978, he married a fundamentalist Christian nurse named Margaret, and she changed his life. He quit drinking and chewing tobacco overnight, an achievement that, given the slavish addiction to both drugs, slavish addiction to both drugs, represented an incredible feat of willpower. And it was amazing that he never really went back to those things either. He built a really impressive home in Goldbridge with lumber that he felled and milled. And this is the last part I want to read. The late 70s were boom times for the timber industry, and Hadwin rode out the wave. It was a good time to have a forest technician's degree, a two-year degree that he had picked up in skip the boot thing. A two-year degree that he had picked up in 1973. In many ways, Hadwin's mandate wasn't all that different from Mackenzie's or Lewis or Clark's. Go out into the wilderness, find out what is of value, and come back with a plan for extracting it. In addition to the understanding of forests as a relative commercial value, the job requires a great sensitivity to the lay of the land. Through a dense and sheer mountain wilderness, he had to be able to visualize and engineer a gentle pathway and, in effect, a wheelchair access for heavy equipment. The catch in Hadwin's case was that if he did the job correctly, it would mean that the same wilderness he took pleasure in exploring would soon be accessible to off-road logging trucks capable of carrying 100-ton loads, and men with orders to level the designated cutbacks as rapidly as possible. Hadwin wasn't just good at this, he had moments of true brilliance. So this is a Studebaker pickup truck that this isn't his, but this is a Studebaker pickup truck, so you can see what it looks like that he was sleeping in out in the snow at times when he was younger and drinking still. This is one of the roads that Hadwin actually designed. That's now a paved road, but it was a logging road at the time. Now imagine this being complete forest. You're on the ground here, and you have to envision where a road would go, and not only where that road would go, but how do you get essentially tractor-trailer-size equipment up and down that road when it's loaded with, thousands and thousands of pounds of logs. And this is what a clear cut looks like after it's done. This is a human for scale. The chapter will go on just to mention that not a lot of people really see the timber industry up close. This is those who are really in the industry. If you've ever, I'm sure you haven't. I have a degree in forestry, and I've only been to a clear cut once, and it looks similar to this for miles and miles. And the chapter mentioned that it looked like a tornado or an earthquake happened. I remember thinking it looked like a war zone after I walked through it. It was really hard to move. It looked like everything had gotten blown up, even though things had just been cut down. And it will be ugly for a while before things start to grow back. A lot of this is blocked off from human view. A lot of the areas that are clear-cut these days are far away, or else they put a buffer zone up between what people can see and what's actually being cut. Hadwin would see this. Grant Hadwin would first see deep, dark forest. He would next see people coming in building roads, and then he would see this as the end product. Then he would be asked to go do this again someplace else, and that was his job. And he was very, very good at it. So that was a lot of information. It was a really important chapter. In fact, the next couple are just as important, so they might be a little bit longer, and then we'll get back to some shorter videos. Thanks for staying with it.